how sociological thinking can help us understand how to actually just know stuff, right? How to understand the world around us, how to decide what to believe in, what not to believe in. We live in a time where we can find data to basically support anything that we want to believe in, right? We simply have to type in to our Google search anything, and we can find someone gathering evidence to support that belief. Even when it doesn't make logical sense, you can find data. Doesn't mean it's good data, but we know it's out there, right? And this type of stuff matters. We can see it affect political beliefs. We can see us turning to different data to believe bad things are going to happen or good things are going to happen, when to believe in the stock market going up, when to believe in the stock market going down, whether we should believe in the coronavirus and how to protect ourselves against the coronavirus, right? This affects our daily activities. This is a very important topic. Now, you could spend lots of time working through how to analyze data. I recommend taking a sociology stats class. If you're scared of math, but you want to take a class to actually understand how you can use math to better understand the world, I recommend sociology statistics. It doesn't require a great understanding of math. What it requires is an ability to appreciate how we can gather information about the world, and then it gives us the tools to analyze that data. But what we're going to think about here is just some basic tips of, kind of a starting point of how to know when to trust or when not to trust data. The two readings that you have this week, which are the basis for the in-class writing, are all about this. They're both, at this point, going to be a little bit more of classic readings. I think they're both from the early 90s. We've got Joel Best, Andrew Cherling. They both continue to produce writing about this. Joel Best has this awesome story about public fear and how moral panics take place. In particular, one of the examples he uses is the idea of a razor in Halloween candy, which is this very, very, very rare thing to happen. It's something that almost never occurs. It's statistically something that isn't even worth thinking about. But why is it that we're so obsessed with that story? Why is it that certain types of panics take hold? And then you've got Andrew Cherling, who has just done a ton of work about, again, how to interpret when we should actually, or how to better understand when we should believe something or when we should not believe something. But let's just go to some basic terminology. We're not going to spend a whole ton of time in this lecture, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And hopefully this is useful as you move forward in the world, as you consume media, as you decide, again, what to believe in. First thing is, you're going to hear this as you move through college. Correlation does not equal causality. This is something sociologists like to say over and over and over again. Correlation means that two things are happening at the same time, or they seem to be related to each other, right? You see X, and then you tend to see Y. When you don't see X, you tend not to see Y. Causality is when we actually know the link between the two things. We know that X, an increase in X, actually leads to an increase in Y. We know that there's a relationship between the two. It could be a positive relationship, meaning more of X leads to more of Y, or it could be a negative relationship. If you see one go up, you see the other go down. So correlation just means there seems to be a pattern. They seem to be happening at the same time. Causality is we actually understand there's a relationship. To show that there is a relationship, there needs to be at least three things happening. The first is correlation, right? You can't show there's a relationship between two things if they're not happening around the same time, right? There has to be some pattern. There has to be some tendency. So that's the first thing. When I see X, I tend to see Y. Next thing that you need to show is that there's a time order. The thing that causes the other thing has to happen first, right? If you get it reversed, then you screw up the order, right? You could say something like, what would be a good example of something with causality, right? Getting kicked in the knee, and then I feel pain. I can say, that person kicking me in the knee led to the pain. X leads to Y. It tends to be correlation. If I get kicked, it hurts. It seems like there's a connection between the act of getting hit in the leg and there being pain. There's a time order also. The kick happens and the pain happens. If the pain happens first and then you get kicked, well, then something else is going on, right? And you can think about this happening with injuries in sports. What was the thing that actually showed the problem first? How do we know what caused the other thing? All right, so we've got time order. I hope that makes sense. You could think about, I started taking vitamins and then I felt healthy, right? So vitamins seem to happen before the health. However, Was it that I was doing all these other things and started to feel healthy, and then I started taking vitamins? So maybe it's those other things, right? So you always need to know the order, which actually happened first. The third thing is spuriousness. You need to show there's not a spurious factor. A spurious factor means there was something else involved that led to the increase in X and also the increase in Y, right? So for example, in the summer, there are increased ice cream sales, and there are also increased amounts of drowning, people drowning. Does that mean ice cream sales in some way lead to drowning? No, right? Even though we could say, well, if you look at the time order, ice cream sales tend to go up before drowning goes up. So it seemed like we have a time order, but there's actually a spurious factor, right? What's the spurious factor? The heat, the summer, right? With the sun, with the heat, more people are likely to eat ice cream and more people are likely to be swimming, which could lead to drowning. It means there's a third variable. So to show a causal relationship, you have to show they're happening around the same time. One happens and then the other happens, whether it goes up or down. And there's not some other factor that actually explains what's going on. There's a website that I believe he's a statistician. I can't remember if he has a sociology background, but a statistician put together this website. His name is Tyler Vigen, and all he does is he runs a bunch of data. Here, let me get rid of that click to add title. All he does is he runs a bunch of data to demonstrate how you can have incredibly high correlation, but it doesn't necessarily mean causality. Perfect correlation, which you almost never find in the world because the world is a confusing, messy place, perfect correlation would be 1. Every time you see X, Y happens. Every single time one occurs, the other definitely occurs. They go up at the same time and they go down at the same time. If there's more of one thing, there's going to be more of the other. If there's going to be less of one thing, there's going to be less of the other. That's a perfect 1 correlation. 0 correlation would mean you never see them at the same time. It's completely random. The patterns have nothing to do with each other. Now, what the statistician does is he takes this giant amount of data that exists out in the world. He focuses on the United States, and he says, look at all these examples of things that tend to have almost perfect correlation, and yet clearly they don't have causality. For example, the yellow is per capita consumption of cheese. The blue is the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Clearly no relationship to each other, right? But if you wanted to lie with data, which people do all the time, if you want to lie with numbers, if you want to lie with charts, if you want to lie with data, look, they're almost perfectly related to each other. Another one, look, these patterns, 9.992. 0.992 is incredible. It's almost exactly 1. It rounds up to 1. Seems like a perfect relationship. U.S. spending on science, space, and technology, suicide by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. No relationship to each other. It would be hard to demonstrate that these two had anything to do with each other. I can't figure out what it would be. Almost perfect correlation. Correlation does not equal causality. This happens all the time in the news. People say, hey, these two things are going up. Teens are suddenly doing X. Teens are suddenly making TikTok videos. And look, teens are also engaging in this other activity. Drug use has gone up, or whatever you want to come up with. Doesn't mean there's a relationship. Teens are suddenly listening to this type of music, and look what else is happening. Yeah, there's a correlation. That doesn't mean there's causality. Another example from his website. Divorce rates in Maine, per capita consumption of margarine. No connection to each other, right? Absolutely no connection. Again, almost perfect correlation. All right, another example of how you see this all the time in the news, in the media. Depression and smartphones, which is a good news source. If you want to think of a magazine that draws on a lot of sociological thinking, draws on a lot of good data to make their arguments, I'd say The Atlantic is one of the ones to check out. So The Atlantic, drawing on a bunch of studies that took place in psychology and social psychology, and I do sometimes think that psychology falls prey a little bit to this mistake of attaching causality to things that really have more correlation. But recently, The Atlantic ran a story called Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation? Really good story, worth reading, and what they look at is all these different trends in American youth. And what they're saying is smartphone usage has increased dramatically. We can't deny this. The data shows this. Our own lives show this. I first got my smartphone, a cell phone, when I was in college. A lot of you first got your cell phone when you were 9 years old, 8 years old. I'd be surprised if anyone did not have access to a cell phone by the time they were 16, right? If you're in the age range between, say, 18 and 22, you got a cell phone when you're pretty young. Not only did you get a cell phone when you're younger, but you're using it for more things. When I got my cell phone, basic texting and phone calls. I didn't do that much. Now think about how much time you spend on your cell phone. If you're bored, you pick up your cell phone. If you need to send an email, you pick up your cell phone. If you need to do anything, you pick up your cell phone, right? Now, this story is looking at trends and saying, well, what is the effect of this, right? Because we know that cell phone use has gone up, and they work through all the studies coming from this various psychologists and social psychologists. And then this is the part I want to show you. Then they get to all the numbers and data. And I'll share this link so you can take a look at it. I'll share it in the YouTube comments, or in the commentary, not the comments, the description of the YouTube video. But look at all these stats, right? Here are the stats looking at a portrait of the United States. Well, we've seen smartphones usage go up, right? We can see it dramatically increase in 2007. That's kind of the tipping point. Well, what else happened? People are not hanging out with their friends as much. Up until 2007, pretty steady. We see the increase in smartphone use around 2007, and then look how often people go and hang out with their friends. That becomes rarer and rarer, both 8th grade, 10th grade, and 12th grade. People just aren't doing that. Maybe they're using their smartphones instead. Other patterns. People are not driving as much. People are not dating as much. People are having less sex. This is worth pointing out, and the reason I'm pointing this out is this is one of those moral panics. Every 5 years, there's a new panic that takes place, usually in more conservative media or more conservative podcasts or media outlets. And it's saying, what's going on with the sexuality of our teenagers? They're more promiscuous than ever before. This is a dangerous thing. The data simply isn't showing that. People are having less sex when they're in high school, when they're in college, even as they get older. Sex in the United States has actually dropped. And one of the times, if you look at a pattern, seems to have dropped a little bit, again, with cell phone use. More likely to feel lonely. Dramatic increase here, right? There was actually dipping before 2007. Look, with increased cell phone usage, look at this skyrocketing of being lonely and being depressed. Not getting as much sleep. Again, cell phone use goes up, people are getting less sleep. Now, what I want to point out here, this data is important. These are things that we need to think about. There is clearly correlation. You do need to ask, does this show causality? We can't exactly get at time order here. Maybe it's because cell phones came out and then people started sleeping less. Maybe cell phones came out and then people started to feel more lonely. Maybe the causality goes the opposite direction. If you're more lonely, aren't you more likely to turn to your technology, right? Why is it that the technology led to the loneliness? Could be possible, but we can't make these claims without having time order. Or let's look at spuriousness. Maybe something changed with the organization of society that wasn't about cell phones. Maybe it was a different technology. Maybe it was something to do with the economy. Maybe it was a shift in politics. We don't know, right? That's my point. This is really useful. Correlation matters. But if you really want to make a claim like this, if you want to imply that cell phones did all these things and are the cause of all these things, well, then you need to do a little bit better job. So you need to be careful when you read this type of stuff. Media loves to equate correlation with causality because you can run stories on correlation. It's harder to prove the causality, but it's worth thinking about. If you're approaching it from a critical perspective, from a sociological perspective, you always need to ask yourself, is this actually showing what it says it's showing? Let's use our critical thinking a little bit more. So this was a headline that appeared in the news. When did I first get this? Probably 3 years ago. Appeared in a bunch of different outlets. And I saw this headline that said, among people who watch more than 7 hours of television a day, there's a 50% greater chance they'll develop diabetes. So pause the video here for a second. And what I want you to do, I'm not going to have you turn this as an in-class writing. If we were meeting in person, I would actually have you do that. But what I want you to do is just pause this for a second, use your critical thinking skills, focus on the stuff that I've been talking about so far, on the 2 readings that you had this week, on the lecture so far, especially think about spurious data. What are the key questions you should ask here? Because that's really what I want you to walk away with today. What are some of the questions you need to ask when you're presented with media that you don't know whether or not you should believe it? So pause the video, come up with 3 key questions, and then I'll tell you some of the ones that I came up with. And there's a lot. All right, so hopefully you paused it. Now that's unpaused. Here's a few things you want to ask. First of all, whenever you see something that says 50% greater chance. You need to ask yourself, 50% greater than what, right? If I told you that I was going to give you 50% of $2,000, that's pretty good. I'm about to give you $1,000. If I say I'm going to give you 50% of 10 cents, that's not so good because I'm only going to give you a nickel, right? So 50% greater chance they'll develop diabetes than what? That's the first thing you have to ask. If it's only 1% chance of getting diabetes, well, now it's 1.5% for your life, so that's still really rare. If you had a high percentage already, that 50% more, that could be significant. All right, what are the other things that we need to ask? I would say the most important thing, I mean, you could say correlation, is there actually the data, this data is real, so there is correlation for sure. You could ask the order of events, so maybe it's time order, and that people who are more likely to develop diabetes, they're less likely to be active because they're, I don't know, in some way their body is more of a struggle to use, and therefore you're more likely to watch TV. That's kind of a harder argument to create. Maybe you could do that. But the thing that's more important to ask is, well, is there a spurious variable, right? For instance, if you spent 7 hours of day of watching television, but while you were watching television, you were on an elliptical or doing some sort of activity where your heart was moving and your lungs were working, would you still have a 50% chance greater of developing diabetes? Maybe while you're watching TV, you're eating a particular food. Is that the cause? Is it about eating sugary food, right? So you need to ask, what is that actually measuring? Maybe there's a spurious factor that explains both. Probably being sedentary isn't that great for our body. No matter what, if you sit still for that period of time, it's not a great thing. So there's probably a spurious factor. The other thing that you need to look at is 7 hours straight or 7 hours with gaps, right? A bunch of 30-minute periods, is that the same as 7 hours is straight through? So you need to always ask questions. Another example, the health and wellness benefits of housework including preventing breast cancer, according to a new study. So this study shows that if you're doing housework, you're less likely to get breast cancer. Again, this is a classic example of there being a spurious factor. It's about movement, it's about activity, and then you have to ask yourself, who's writing this article and why does it get so much attention? There seems like there's a gendered part of the story, right? Does housework also help men alleviate a chance of cancer? Right? Why are we focused on housework and women? So again, you have to say, well, what's going on? Who's writing the story? Is there more information? What type of questions do I need to ask? Here's another example, and this is one of my favorite ones, because back before I was at Brockport, I was at Utica College, which is not that far from here. And at Utica College, let's see if I can get this small enough so you can actually see it. It's going to be kind of hard, but at Utica College, they have a really good nursing department. It's one of the things they're known for. Similar to Brockport, Brockport has an amazing nursing program too. But the Utica nursing program, what they would do is every month they would send out a health and wellness newsletter where they would give you little bits of advice. They would dispel some myths, right? They would take pride in saying, hey, here's some things that people believe that might not be true that are worth knowing. And then they would give little tips. And one of the things I saw was the statement right here. Look, they're talking about diet. They're recommending things about sleep. Mediterranean diet is always seen to be one of the healthiest diets in the world. So they're talking about that. And this is true. It's one of the things to look into. But then they said this thing about processed meat. The World Health Organization has just released a study which ranks bacon, ham, and sausage as a major cause of cancer. Processed and cured meats are now considered Group 1 carcinogen, the same category as asbestos, alcoholic, arsenic, and tobacco. Each 1.8 ounce serving eating daily increases your risk of colorectal cancer by 18%. All right, that's pretty scary, right? We see that this meat, this stuff that we love, whether it's bacon, whether it's hot dogs, anything that's processed like this, increases your chance of colorectal cancer. Not something anyone wants to get. All right, sounds like we need to stop eating meat. That's what the newsletter is telling us. But again, let's use our critical thinking skills and think about what we do when we're presented with data. First thing that we do is say 18%. All right, so it increases our chances by 18%. Okay, 18% of what? So I looked at the math. I looked it up. And what I saw was in the United States, a person's lifetime odds of getting colorectal cancer are about 4.5%. So that means that if you go from 4.5% up by 18%, it would bring you to 5.3%. Moving from 4.5 to 5.3 doesn't seem like that much. That doesn't seem that scary anymore. However, there's another key part we have to look at. Each 1.8 ounce serving, so that's about 3 strips of bacon, I think. Each time you eat that daily increases your risk of colorectal cancer by 18%. Here's where we have to look at wording. This goes back to the Joel Best reading that you have for this week. It seems to be implying every time I have that serving of bacon, my chances of getting this cancer go up by 18%. Meaning, if I have bacon once a week for the rest of this year, I'm almost certainly going to get this type of cancer. This is where the wording is flawed, and it's got reproduced over and over. What this is actually telling us is if one of you eats bacon every single day for the rest of your life, then it's going to go up a total of 18%. So meaning you would go from 4.5 to 5.3 if you eat bacon every single day of your life, right? Again, suddenly a lot less scary. All right, what are some other data traps? Let's get through. I'll go through these ones a little bit quicker because I'm basically just going to give you some things to consider. And then I'll leave it at that. So data traps. Mean, median, and mode are different. None of these are lies. However, you need to ask yourself why one is being used and not the other. Mean is simply the average, right? You take all the numbers, you add them up, and you divide it by the total. That's the mean. Median, you list all the numbers in a row, and you choose the two that are, or the one that is right in the middle. Mode is the number that appears most frequently. That's the one that's the most rarely used. So why does it matter? Here's an example. Between 2010 and 2013, the mean income of the American family rose 4% to $87,000. So in those 3 years, the average American family, the average income went up to $87,000. During that same time, the median income of the American family dropped by 5% to $46,000. All right, both of these are true. Neither of these are manipulated statistics. How is this possible? How could both of these stories be correct? Again, pause the video, think a little bit, and then come back. All right, so now that you're back, here's the way that we can understand this. The mean, the average, can be dragged either up or down by extreme numbers, right? So if we take a test in class and all of you receive 85, which is a B, and one of you receives a 0, that 0 is going to drag the average down a lot, even though it's only one of you, right? So what we're seeing here is the average income is going up. Why is it happening? Because the wealthiest in the country are making more money. We see the creation of more billionaires during this time, and that's dragging the average up. So it's telling a story about total wealth in the United States. Not a lie, but it's telling a story about total wealth where the increase in the billionaires is dragging it up. At the same time, the median, because it simply lists the numbers in a row, so an extreme number like a billionaire, or when you take a test, an extreme number like a 0, that just counts as the low number. And then you just move on. It doesn't have as much weight. So what we're seeing here is that more people are actually making less money during that time, slightly less, drops by 5%, and the working and lower class in the United States is actually doing poorer than we think if we just look at the mean income, right? So if you don't want extreme numbers to have an impact, use median and not mean. Misleading graphs. In general, a bar chart should include a 0. Now, the reason for that is with bar charts, you're trying to have a comparison, right? And if you don't have a 0, it's going to exaggerate difference, right? If you look at this chart, it's going to look like there's a huge difference between the hours that people work in an average week in Romania versus a place like Italy, but it's really not that different, right? That's a very small difference. 41.2 versus 38.1, 3 hours a week is not very much, right? But it looks like a huge difference when you include that 0. In contrast, a line graph, because you're trying to show movement, that's the point of a line graph, you generally don't include the 0. that draws you out so much that you can't see difference. If you're including the zero, it's a great way to show that something isn't happening when something might actually be happening. If you want to show that climate change is not occurring, include that zero in the line graph and it looks pretty steady. If you actually zoom in, we can see there's a difference, right? The average temperature is increasing about 2 degrees between 1900 and 2000. So you're better able to see the change. Other thing you need to pay attention to, the inverted axis. We're used to seeing the zero on the bottom. That doesn't always happen. Make sure you pay attention to the zero. This was an advertisement run in the newspaper. It was funded, the data was from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and was funded by a group that was trying to support the idea of the Stand Your Ground law. The Stand Your Ground law is a controversial law that started receiving a ton of attention when Trayvon Martin was shot and killed by George Zimmerman. Right? He said it was a stand your ground law. Someone was coming towards him and he had the ability to shoot back because he was standing his ground. So this group ran this advertisement showing, hey, look, since the stand your ground law was passed, it seems like gun death has actually gone down. The only problem is they put the zero at the top, which is a little bit tricky, right? Because when you flip it upside down like we're used to, we see after the stand your ground law was passed, you see a rise in gun death. Now, we don't know if that's correlation. We don't know if it's causality, but we can be sure that this was designed and put out in a way that would deceive us, right? If you read it quickly, you actually mistake what the chart is showing you. I'm not going to talk a lot about surveys and polls. I think the reading that you have this week does a really good job with that. So I'm just going to leave it there. I'm hoping it makes sense. If you read that and you're a little bit confused, please email me and I will record a short, I'll keep it in 5 to 10 minutes, a separate video explaining a little bit more about how to think about surveys. I think it's really important. I think it's useful. I just think that reading is really easy. And the people that are interviewed for it do a great job explaining it. So just tell me if you want an explanation. So I'll skip those slides for the sake of time. And then I'll just tell you some final tips to think about. Never trust a single answer or things that sound too good to be true. Always think critically about that stuff, right? If something doesn't seem like it makes sense, then look for further information, right? If it doesn't make sense immediately, you probably should be questioning it. New information is not always better, right? This is how science works. You produce a study, another study comes along that can test it. However, you want to see what methods were better. Were the samples different? Which one was from a more reputable source? So don't always just assume new is better. Not always the case. Always ask who paid for the study. Did that group have a special interest, right? Is there a reason that they might want a certain result to be had? In medicine, industry-funded trials are 4 times more likely to get positive results than independently funded trials. If a pharmaceutical company runs a trial, they're more likely to get the result they want. This is not because they're lying about what happens, right? They're not making up trials. However, they're more likely to run more trials and share the ones that support their cause, right? So we do need to ask, is this also independently reviewed? Is there a group, usually there's some sort of government agency, maybe it's a university that's also doing the testing. Other things to think about. Published research is always better if it's peer-reviewed. If you get something out of a journal, you can trust it more than if you get it out of an op-ed or a newspaper or a blog online. The journal quality matters. Better journals are more likely to have more reviewers, which just means there's more experts in the field who have the ability to say, hey, that's good research, that finding makes sense, or say, that's not great, that article should be rejected. It should not yet be published. And then other things that I brought up, correlation does not always equal causation. Do not mix those two up. Housework does not, and breast cancer, that was an example of that. Another classic one is the idea that old people raise the temperature, right? If you look at a place like Florida where a lot of old people live, it's much hotter than a place like Colorado where a lot of young people live. The reason is temperature, warm places, older people are likely to seek out those spots. It's not that they're raising the temperature. Time order matters. So hopefully this made sense. Hopefully this provides you with just some useful things to think about when you're confronted with some sort of study, some sort of argument, some sort of news source, some sort of media, right? So pay attention to this stuff. And that's all I've got for this week. Let me know if you need me to record any follow-ups to any of these slides. If I went too fast, if anything's confusing, do let me know.